of the main focuses on the miraculous nature of the Quran has been its linguistic inimitability.
Although it is still something that is a challenge that stays until this day, because the Arabic language is a living language. People can still pick up the Quran who speak Arabic and read it and understand it and comprehend it, even though this book is 1,400 years old. You would be very hard pressed. In fact, I don't even know if there is another book like this in the world today.
Every last ayah of the Quran is a miracle. This is what we believe. How many ayat of Quran are predictions? Very few. How many ayat of Quran are dedicated to scientific phenomena? Very few. How many of these things were even known to the Arabs of that time? Almost nothing. So what is it that mesmerized these people?
Allah
Azza wa Jalla, He says in Surah Al-Muddathir, وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ. You notice something? It's spelled backwards and forwards the same way. In English literature, we call this a palindrome. Something that spells backwards and forwards the same way, like Bob or race car. That would be a simple translation of وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ. Try to say, declare the greatness only of your Lord in English or French or German or Japanese. You pick the language. Say it so that it spells backwards and forwards the same way. I can translate the ayah, but could I translate the miracle? Allah Azza wa Jalla speaks of all heavenly bodies. Each of them in their own assigned space, they are floating, swimming, rotating. Spell out the first words, kullun fi falak. You notice something? What letter are they rotating around? The word He used for rotating, yasbahun, yeah. How do human beings come up with that? Allah Azza wa Jalla speaks, and this is not written form. This is not written word. This is spoken word.
The Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, was not a literate man. He was not a man of letters. That's not what he was known to be. Yet he came with this book, outstanding in its qualities, a masterpiece of literature, unlike which the Arabs had never heard before. And the proof of it, the proof that it was from God to the Arabs, was its eloquence, its mastery of the language.
What is it that every time the messenger opened his mouth, that they would be, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, they would be dumbfounded. They didn't know what to say.
Why were they moved and we're not moved? Because they were pioneers in the Arabic language. They were at the peak of eloquency in the Arabic language. All of them knew beyond any doubt when they heard the Quran that it was a miracle from Allah and only a revelation from Allah.
I found a book in my university library the other day by an Egyptian named Abdul Razak Nawfal called Al-I'jaz Al-Adadi for the Quran Kareem, where he went through and he counted various words, and he found some interesting stuff.
The word land appears 13 times in the Quran, and the word sea 32 times, giving a total of 45 references. If we divide that number by that of the number of references to the land, we arrive at the figure 28, the number of total references to land and sea, 45, divided by the number of references to the sea in the Quran, 32, is 71 extraordinarily. These figures represent the exact proportions of land and sea on the earth today.
And today we realize that the sea covers 71.1% of the earth, and land is 28.8%. So even the amount of times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the percentage of earth and land, the ratio is exactly similar to that today. And how can Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam know this? Did he go and measure the ocean?
So this field remains one which is kind of dubious. It's not something that should be rejected utterly, but it certainly requires investigation. One of the most amazing things in the Quran, really, to me, is this historical delicacy of the wording and its accuracy.
One of the individuals referred to in the context of Pharaoh is Haman. He is mentioned in 6 different places in the Quran, in which we are informed that he was one of Pharaoh's closest allies. Surprisingly, the name Haman is never mentioned in those sections of the Old Testament pertaining to the life of Prophet Moses.
Is there a mention of a Haman in the Bible? Sure. Is there a mention of Haman building a tower? Sure. But the Haman in the Bible didn't work for Pharaoh. He worked for another king named Xerxes in the biblical book of Esther. So the biblical Catholic scholars in the 1600s, who were first getting into Orientalist studies, Islamic studies, they looked this thing up in the Quran and said, aha, we found a mistake in the Quran. Look, they're talking about Haman working under Pharaoh, while the book of Esther tells us that Haman worked under the king named Xerxes 1,000 years after the Pharaoh in Babylon, not even in Egypt, and he built them a tower. You ever heard of the story, the Tower of Babylon? So they challenged the historical integrity of the Quran. Ma'adallah, they said, from the disbeliever's point of view, oh, Muhammad must have plagiarized it from a priest and made a mistake because he mixed up the story of the Tower of Babel, right? And the story of Xerxes with the story of the Pharaoh, and he's confused between the two of them. That's what he did. Misquotation in the Quran.
The hieroglyphs, the Egyptian language, was only decoded many centuries after. So where did the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ get this knowledge from?
Now check this out. You know Maurice Bucaille, this famous Muslim who wrote Bible, Quran and science? Before he got into that subject, he was a historian. He wanted to study Islamic history. When he came across this problem presented by Catholic priests, he did a little research. You see, what happened in the late 1800s was the Egyptian hieroglyphics were now being revived as a language. So they got into this study, and they made documentations of who the ministers that are mentioned in the documents of the Egyptians, what their roles were, etc., etc. So he travels to Germany to look up the names of different architects and constructors and ministers under the name, under the Pharaoh, specifically under the Pharaoh at the time of historical era of Musa alayhi salam, of Moses. What does he find? Haman, minister of the stone quarries, construction. This name is discovered in the 1900s. And this is something they didn't have, but which speaker had? The messenger of Allah, but actually the speaker is who then? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is just from the historical point of view. Something that they used to laugh at the Muslims came back and blew up in their own face.
Haman was indeed mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions. The same inscription also indicated the close relationship between Haman and the Pharaoh. In the Dictionary of People in the New Kingdom, which was prepared based on the entire collection of inscriptions, Haman is said to be the head of stone quarry workers.
كيف ذقت سعادة قد جاوزت في الرفعة الأفلاك.
أتلو كتاب الله في أفيائه شمس الفلاح منيرة دنياك تسمو بروحك للثريا ترتجي أعلى المراتب ساميا بهداك.
The title that's used for the ruler in the story of Yusuf in the Quran is Al-Malik, the king.
Why does the Quran make this differentiation at 2 points in time? The Quran mentions a title for the leader of the Egyptians in two ways. In the story of Joseph or Yusuf alayhi salam, the Quran mentions Malik, king, which means ruler, king or sultan. But in the story of Moses, Musa alayhi salam, the Quran mentions the Pharaoh, or in Arabic, Fir'aun.
So it turns out that the period of time that Joseph came to Egypt was when the Hyksos were ruling. That ruler would not have been called Pharaoh or Fir'aun. By the time they left Egypt with Musa, their memory of the time of Yusuf, all the details were not very precise, so they backdated, or they applied the term Fir'aun in their stories, which were related by oral history, until they were eventually written down. They called the ruler at the time of Joseph Pharaoh.
The Bible, which was existing at that time, never mentioned king, always mentioned Pharaoh. The Torah never mentioned king, always mentioned Pharaoh.
You know, that's pretty amazing. If Muhammad ﷺ was copying stories that he'd heard from the Jews, then how on earth did he avoid that mistake?
يدعو للعلم وللعمل لا شيء سواه يهذبنا